Growing up, I was a huge James Bond fan. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that my father and grandfather were also huge James Bond fans. So it was something that if it was on TV or we wanted a Saturday night or Friday night movie from the video store, I could watch that with my grandfather or my father. And I was very close with my grandfather, and he would babysit us a lot. So that would kind of be our Saturday night thing. We'd go out, rent a Bond movie from the local video store, get some potato chips and Diet Coke, and watch a Bond film. So it's a very important part, I guess you could say, of when I was growing up, and I have a lot of fond memories of it. So recently I've been going back and rewatching them because I haven't seen a lot of these movies in like 10 years or so. And it's kind of interesting sometimes to go back and look at stuff you saw when you were younger and to say, does it still hold up? Was it nostalgia that made me think this is better than it was? Or is it better than I remember it being? Or is it just kind of different? And recently, I don't know, I've just been on a bit of a James Bond kick. Maybe because of all the trailers and ongoing delays of No Time to Die, which looks absolutely terrible. And I kind of soured on the franchise a bit because I haven't really liked any of the Craig movies. The only times I've really said I've liked them is kind of when I've been, I guess you could say, bullied or I've kind of jumped on the bandwagon. I think part of it was Quantum of Solace was so bad that Skyfall and Spectre seemed better by comparison, but I don't particularly like either of them. I don't even really like Casino Royale, to be honest with you. I think I'd prefer pretty much any of the pre Craig films to the Craig films. That's not really an issue with Daniel Craig. It's just the Craig era films aren't really Bond films. They're kind of something completely different. So I started watching them again. I figured why not go back and watch Doctor No? Because I remember thinking that was like the most boringest one as a kid. And I started watching it and I'm like, this is a really good movie. This is a lot better than I remember it being. I guess because kind of as an adult, I can appreciate more stuff like pacing, the writing. Because I know more about the world, I can kind of appreciate the settings and the set pieces. I'm a little more kind of aware of the whole genre thing. Like something I'd never really thought about till I was rewatching them is the Bond films owes a lot to like Victorian era adventure literature, like Jules Verne, H. Rider Haggard. I mean, there's a reason why Bond and Indiana Jones basically have a crossover with Sean Connery showing up in The Last Crusade, and you kind of have the continuation of that in the kind of the pulpy stuff like Conan the Barbarian or H.P. Lovecraft. But I always like that Lost World stuff, and this definitely owes a lot to it. For a lot of the earlier movies, I would imagine, this would be the first time people were really getting an intimate look at it. Like, You Only Live Twice might have been the first time a lot of people were really getting a close peek at what post-war Japan looked like. And just seeing how this city that had been devastated in Tokyo was like this thriving advanced metropolis, and Japan was like an advanced country now. And just seeing that, like even in something like The Man with the Golden Gun, seeing Macau and I believe it's Thailand, it's just they're very interesting exotic locales, and I do appreciate that. And Bond always like does at least something with the local culture, be it going to some sort of event or going to some particular landmarks or something like that. So there is a strong travel vlog aspect of it, which frankly I like. But as I was kind of started rewatching them, I noticed that for movies that are like 2 to 2.5 hours long, so they're reasonably long films, they tend to have very good pacing. They tend to alternate pretty well between fast and slow scenes. I don't really find myself getting bored. The writing is, generally speaking, very good. Maybe it's just because I've seen more films. I think also part of it is it's just very refreshing, particularly the older ones, to see something that's just an unabashed male power fantasy, I guess you could say, that doesn't really care about trying to be subversive or like screwing with expectations. It's just like good versus evil. You got the alpha male, you got the Chad. He's going out, he's killing terrorists and commies and stuff like that. Hot women just throw themselves at him. It's just kind of nice to see that played straight, and there's not really a lot of cynicism in it. Pierce Brosnan, I think, kind of tackles that and does that well in a way that Casino Royale, that the Craig films, I don't think do. And I'll definitely get into the Brosnan films because I do really like them. Before I guess we kind of go further, I think my two favorite Bond films are GoldenEye and You Only Live Twice. You Only Live Twice, I think, is the best. I don't know if you want to call it classic Bond or kind of the first half of the series. And GoldenEye is the best of the second half of the series. I think it's hard to compare different Bonds or even different movies because it's so long, and that's kind of one of the interesting things about it is like they made one of these movies like almost every other year. When we're looking at the Sean Connery ones, they made, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They made 5 movies in 7 years. I think the only real major gap you had was between License to Kill and GoldenEye. I'm not really sure why. I'm sure there was kind of some interesting production stuff going on during that time period. But it's just really long. And it's kind of, I think, hard because people argue who's the best Bond. I think that they kind of aren't really trying to compete with each other. And I think that's something that's good about it. Sean Connery's a bit more of a, I don't know if you want to call him, he's a bit more of a bruiser, a bit more of, I guess, kind of a brute, a lot more kind of aggressive, and a bit of a dick, I guess you could say. Roger Moore is a lot more kind of slapsticky and blonde. Timothy Dalton is like really hardcore, and Pierce Brosnan does kind of a schmarmy, really charming take on the character. So I don't know if you can really say one's better or worse than another because they're going for different things. Some of the movies, like the Roger Moore ones, are a lot more comedic in tone, and then some of them are a lot more serious in tone, like something like maybe GoldenEye or the Dalton films. They also really differ in terms of what genre they are. Like, let's just maybe take a couple. So, like, Moonraker is basically a science fiction movie. A lot of the James Bond movies are kind of science fiction-y, although some of them are kind of more realistic, I guess, than others. You Only Live Twice takes a lot of aspects from Japanese cinema, at least from my understanding, like from kung fu movies and martial arts epics and that sort of thing. On Her Majesty's Secret Service and From Russia with Love are more, I guess you could say, they're kind of like chase movies where they're constantly moving and they're constantly getting closed in on. GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies are like big, brash 1990s action movies like The Matrix or Mask of Zorro or something, where it's just really over the top and just kind of a focus on being really cool. The Dalton ones are a lot more like Scarface or something that's a lot more serious and hardcore. Octopussy and A View to a Kill are 1980s movies, and they have that weird 1980s vibe. Live and Let Die is a blaxploitation film, because I guess that was popular during the time period. So I think that's kind of interesting that you really have a diversity of genres within ostensibly one movie series. The other really interesting thing about the Bond films is they're very reflective of the particular time period they're made in. They're very much a snapshot of the time. And since there's so many of them and they're made at such regular intervals, it's really fascinating to kind of watch through them and just kind of watch society change as you're just looking at it. And I mean that in kind of all regards, be it they reflect the current culture, whatever film genres, important, the current fears and paranoias of the era. They always seem to try to make it as relevant as possible to what's currently going on. So maybe to just kind of go through a couple of these. So we have Goldfinger, and by that I mean like whatever, if there's a world crisis, kind of whatever is the big geopolitical story of the day. So Goldfinger, I think, is kind of inspired by the Sino-Soviet split, which was a big thing at the time, and kind of the emergence of China as being this third power in the world. You see this in a couple movies. I think that's also in You Only Live Twice. It's implied the Chinese are paying Blofeld. But you have this idea where the Chinese are trying to become the third global superpower as they hired Goldfinger as part of their scheme, which we can talk about later. On Her Majesty's Secret Service came out in the aftermath of the foot and mouth disease panic, and it talks about that quite a bit. The Man with the Golden Gun came out obviously during the energy crisis, and they reference it in the movie. Specifically, You Only Live Twice came out during kind of, I guess, the height of the space race. Moonraker was right after Star Wars, so they figured they'd do their own one. Also, it's post the end of the space race, so it's not really, they wanted to make a space movie, but they couldn't really do it about the space race anymore, so they did it about, I guess, kind of the emergence of space stations. We have Live and Let Die, which is a blaxploitation film, but it's also kind of a reference to the heroin epidemic. From my understanding, that's when Frank Lucas, the guy who American Gangster is based on, was kind of shipping heroin all over the United States. GoldenEye is very much a post-Cold War film, and it kind of represents the character and, I guess you could say, geopolitics and the changes to culture that happened in the post-Cold War era, and just trying to come to terms with that. With, like, The World Is Not Enough, you have... And Tomorrow Never Dies, you have kind of the transition to non-state enemies. I guess you kind of had that with regards to Spectre, but just kind of more a focus on terrorists rather than any sort of, I guess you could say, grand ideological goal. And let me think some other ones. I think Octopussy kind of reflects the paranoia during the 1980s. Because there's things like Red Storm Rising and then World in Conflict, which I know was made later, but is kind of meant to reflect that time period. There was a concern, from my understanding, that the Soviet Union was aware that it was gradually decaying and falling apart, in that rather than collapsing under economic and social pressures, what the Russians might try to do is just do a Hail Mary, all-in YOLO offensive and try to take out NATO and take Europe, and hopefully kind of cut some deal in order to keep themselves going. But I think Octopussy reflects that. You have the Silicon Valley boom with A View to a Kill. The Living Daylights, obviously Soviet war in Afghanistan. License to Kill was with the whole crack epidemic and kind of all the drug cartel stuff. So my point is, like, all the movies were very topical and relevant, given kind of, like I said, the style of the time, the attitudes of the time, that sort of thing. Like, you can see in the early movies, and this is true with the book series, Britain's still a world power. Britain still has a lot of clout. It still has a colonial empire, that sort of thing. But then once you get into the later movies, Britain is just kind of this joke of a country. And I find if you read the last two Ian Fleming books, The Man with the Golden Gun and You Only Live Twice, you very much get the impression of a man who is just kind of longing for death, who feels that he's just lived too long and wants to kind of get it out of the way. Because he kind of lived during the period where Britain was... I'm not sure if you could say Britain was really at its strongest during the interwar period in the 1940s. I'd say it was probably its strongest prior to World War One. But he went from seeing Britain being a global empire to kind of being a socialist hellhole that had abandoned everything that had kind of previously made it a colossus that strode the world. And like a big theme in You Only Live Twice is... Like, Tanaka just makes fun of him in the book a lot as being like the agent of a third-rate power that still thinks it's somehow relevant to the world. So I think that tends to be how I look at the Bond films is what do they kind of say about that particular time period? What is the kind of snapshot in history that they give us? So as I'm going through them, I'm not sure if I'll do all the movies or just some of them, but I'll try to focus on that. The actual character development in the Bond movies isn't its strongest thing. I think Brosnan actually probably does the best job with developing the Bond character. We'll get into that though. So that's part one. We'll get through the rest of the Bond movies. God bless, and we'll talk real soon.